Thanks, Dipti.
Wow,
Welcome, Seher.
invite.
Oh, no, not yet.
Yeah, you can start.
Okay, thanks. Welcome everyone to the winter semester's CCT lecture series. For those who are regular participants of the CCT, you already know the theme for this semester, many languages, many architecture. Those who are joining us for the first time, the series, this lecture series will be focused around the idea of languages and in architecture. Um, and over the course of this series, the focus will be on how one can move beyond the hegemony of orthographic projections and opening up ways of exploring and celebrating the plurality of spatial syntax possible across geography and cultures. Today, we have Seher Shah joining us and continuing this lecture series further with her talk, The Lightness of Mass. Excited to have you over and looking forward for your talk today. Let me briefly introduce Seher Shah. Seher Shah's practice explores the poetics and fractures of architectural space through drawing, printmaking, and sculpture. Her practice as an artist and education in architecture has allowed her for a method of working that is informed by both fields through drawing, abstraction, and materiality. A long-term interest in the role of drawing works with the historic and intimate through the precise traditions of Renaissance perspective methods with an approach that troubles the rational language of architectural drawing. Seher Shah received a Bachelor of Fine Arts and Bachelor of Architecture from Rhode Island School of Design in 1998. Her works are in collections of the Museum of Modern Art New York, Centre Pompidou in Paris, Brooklyn Museum and Queens Museum, New York, to name just a few. And just to add a personal anecdote, I first encountered Seher's work at the Venice Space exhibition curated by Rupali and Prasad at JKK. And I must say, I was completely taken aback by the wonderful, the brute force that her work carry with them. One of the feelings that I had when I encountered those works, as if the ink and graphite itself was sculpted on paper by literal brute force in some sense, by the volumetric poche that, as architects, we are familiar with. Um, you know, uh, take that idea of poche take on a very many new meanings in Seher's work, as we will see today. The fact that her work is very close to architecture and coming from architecture, it would be, I'm sure it will be very engaging and pleasurable for everyone who are attending the talk today. So, Seher, over to you. Welcome.
Thank you, Shreyank. I wanted to thank C, Rupali, and Prasad, you and Anuj as well, for this invitation to come and speak for many languages and many architectures. Let me just see. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yes. Okay. So as you said, I do have an architecture background. I studied fine arts and architecture. I practiced for a few years in New York as well. But I always was, drawn to thinking about architecture and thinking about space in a particular way. And I did feel a disconnect from the place that I was working, which specialized in large scale building projects such as skyscrapers, sort of fairly large scale monumental projects in the landscape. And, when you had invited me to come and speak about this idea of many languages and many architectures, I found myself also thinking back to architecture school and the things that I had learned that I very much use in my sort of practice of drawing. And that is, you know, the mainstays of architectural representation, such as the plan, the elevation, the perspective. And I've very much used my architectural education to not only construct the drawings and the prints and even the sculpture in the last few years, but I've also tried to think about how do I make this language my own? And for me, I found that working you know, through drawing has also helped me try to locate and relearn certain things that were presented to me. How certain historical, iconographic buildings, information, things are presented. Can drawing actually reinterpret that, and how do you translate that? So let me share my screen and just make sure this is that good?
Yes, yes.
So I wanted to share this presentation called Lightness of Mass. And the idea for this is also to speak about certain 3-4 projects that I've worked on, but ultimately really to speak about the process and how these works were done. So they speak about changing and translating things from plan to elevation, elevation to 3 dimensions. And it does this in a number of different works. And for me, in the last, you know, sort of few years, the work ultimately, of course, is the work, but the real sort of engagement also is in the way that the work gets made. And what is the materiality? What is the scale? How does the work actually get made? And that is as much as part of the language that the work is trying to convey as the work itself, when you look at it either through a drawing or through a print, or you walk around a sculpture. So I wanted to share a little bit about some of, you know, the earlier work, and just speak a little bit about the interest that I had sort of earlier. I had been working, as I left the architectural office, I had been interested in working on the large scale perspective drawing. And this is using traditional Renaissance methods of constructing space through perspective. So 1, 2 point, axons, different sorts of methods of engaging with how does a viewer actually enter the drawing space. So I started with work such as this, like the interior courtyard, which is pencil on paper, but sort of looking at more autobiographical spaces. So collapsing spaces that I had remembered from memory, sort of reconstructing them. Things sort of seem to be shifting and constantly in flux. And as time sort of progressed, the autobiographical shifted into things that had been presented to me in architectural school itself. So obviously, modernist architecture played a heavy role in this, in that certain buildings were presented as icons of modern architecture. Obviously, Corbusier's name comes up repeatedly through this. And as I started working through these perspectives, I used the basic elements of architecture, a wall, a grid, a column, a beam, and I started constructing these sorts of narratives, or almost these sets within the perspective drawing, where things seem to be in flux and constantly sort of shifting and moving volumes. As time went on, the work became more spare, and I sort of started focusing on structures much more. This for me in 2011 was quite an important drawing called Object Relic. And it was looking at Corbusier's Unity project in Marseille. And I took the elevation of the building. I stripped out I took out the mass, stripped the height down, and it sort of flattened within the landscape itself. And there is this sort of guillotine-like shard form, which is ultimately sort of the plan as well, that that creates this kind of ambiguous relationship, not just of scale, but also how it's situated in this drawing landscape. And it's a little bit hard to tell through this Zoom interface, but the scale of this is about 8 by 10 feet. So the scale of the body also has a relationship to the way that a viewer would approach the perspective drawing. In 2013, at the end of 2013, I moved from New York to New Delhi. And I wanted to also speak a little bit about this because the shift from New York to New Delhi also has had an impact on the way that I also see things and also how I locate things for myself. And I feel that drawing as a practice for me has sort of, sometimes it's anchored me to think about how do I locate myself within this landscape, whether it's social or political, whether it's also through aesthetics, through modernist aesthetics or the aesthetics of making things. But I'm finding that drawing through its own language, it's something that I'm slowly understanding. How does the drawing itself translate into a language itself through the materiality that is used through the process? These are just some of the drawings from the last few years that are looking at sort of brutalist architecture in the landscape from different sites. So obviously the NDMC in Delhi, Silver Towers in the Kuwait Embassy in Tokyo, but sort of forms and structures in the landscape that are not, they don't softly conform to the landscape around them. They remain their own sort of single entities. And there was something quite interesting about using a very pale, almost ghostly sort of screen or scrim to depict these drawings that were sort of traced from photographic images. And obviously the Hall of Nations itself. So I just also wanted to share just 3 images that have sort of stayed with me over the past few years. One is a figure within the elevation of the NDMC building itself, and I remember walking around this building, and there was something about the scale of the self to architecture, the scale of the self to the city, this figure that's sort of looking out, the materiality of the concrete itself. And in a way, I'm very hesitant in the past few years to also say that, well, this means that, and the drawing means this. And, it's also as I'm working through the drawings, as the marks are being put down, they provoke different reactions, they provoke different interpretations. And I think that has been something that I'm really trying to hold very dear, because things that are not fixed, that can be interpreted in different ways for yourself, for myself. How do I look at things around me, and how do they shift over time, is something that that is quite important to me. The sense of time also through materiality, weathering, how material disintegrates, what are the traces that remain in the landscape, and what are the structures, what are these sort of structures that are also there that represent something of shifting of time, and what is translated. And then how does scale shift? How does it become something intimate in your hand? And obviously, this is not my work. This is actually taken from the Kishkinda Trust in Hampi, where they were weaving banana fiber. But of course, for me, it is almost impossible to not think of weaving and textiles and the grid, and then sort of expand that into architectural elevations, the way things are weathered, And there's quite a rich correlation between scale. So the scale, again, of the intimate, of something that could be in your hand, to the scale of the grid in the city. And these kinds of not ambiguous, but these extreme scales is something that I've been trying to think through, and it finds itself sort of in an ambiguous space of scale and of material. So the first works that I wanted to show was a translation as well of one-dimensional sort of prints to how that eventually becomes three-dimensional objects. In 2014, I was invited to the Glasgow Print Studio for a residency, which has actually really made quite an important, I guess, it has left quite an important way of thinking about material, about process. I am not a printmaker by nature. I draw. My practice is very much in drawing. And when I was invited to Glasgow, I had worked with a master printer to develop a series of etchings, which I will share in a little bit as well. And alongside the etchings, I started working on a series of woodcuts that were taking line and carving it out into a small piece of wood. And of course, the removal of material is ultimately what gets printed. So some quick studies about the silhouettes of the forms, very much for me coming out of sort of concrete, sort of heavy weight, brutalist architecture. And these are some of the smaller woodcuts as well, and some of the actual prints on the left side. This work, Formed by a Cut, is a series of woodcuts that were using the silhouettes that were taken from the etchings themselves. And as I was working through this, I started sort of breaking down the woodcuts further. So I took the woodcuts and started pulling them apart. So they became sort of these objects that you could kind of move around as well. And I started looking at both the negative forms and the positive forms that were coming out of these sort of broken pieces. As I started working on these, I was projecting an idea of an elevation onto these forms as well. Some were elevations, some felt more like plans. And as I continued working on these, it very much seemed like sculptural structures. But I had placed them on this almost like an office paper, grid paper. And it was ambiguous in terms of scale. This could be, very intimate in scale, or this could be building height. And I was quite intrigued by this kind of ambiguous scale set against a background that had no definition, but was ultimately just a gridded space. After the residency, Randhir, my husband and I, Randhir Singh, the architectural photographer, and I went north, and we saw these megaliths as well. So as we were sort of going around Scotland, I was quite drawn to these structures in the landscape. And I was thinking about these almost as lines in the landscape that had been there for an extraordinarily long period of time, a line that had been weathered, a line that could possibly have been carved. And this idea of the landscape around it in flux, but this single point, or this single sort of three-dimensional line static and still. And this, and as you can tell, like the stone itself is quite weathered. There are things that are sort of growing from nature on it. And this just remained with me when I came back to Delhi. And I had been thinking through these woodcuts, and I had this sort of desire to change these into three-dimensional forms. When so the image that you see on the right is one of the patterns that's cast in aluminum, and these are actually quite small in scale. And I think one of the interesting things that I found is that when I've shared these images with people who haven't seen these objects in person, there is a slight sort of ambiguity about the scale. And these are almost small sort of table objects, that vary from 7 to 11 inches in height. So as I was extruding these forms, I was thinking about also the ways that flat one-dimensional changes into three, and what kind of material would speak to this idea of time. And I had been really drawn to cast iron itself, not only because it's a language that also evokes, architectural bridges, industrial objects, but it has this elemental quality to it that if left out, it also weathers. It changes color through its own material patina. So it changes from silver to black if you blacken it, and black to rose, and then rose to red if you leave it without any coating, unprotected. And that was something that I was really drawn to as well, because drawing itself, once it's finished, almost is sort of in a frame, and it, if nothing happens to it, remains static. And I was quite drawn to the idea that a material could also shift and move with time. And so I started working with a foundry on the outskirts of Delhi in Faridabad that did mainly large scale sort of industrial car productions. And I was quite drawn to this process of just traditional sand casting. So the idea again of sort of the negative and the positive, and then that sort of shifting back, that was also something quite interesting in the process of the cast itself. The mixture itself is sand with a sort of mixture included of sugarcane, almost like a sugarcane molasses. So it sort of binds everything together. The image on the right shows you the kind of wooden pattern, the positive, and then obviously these are the negative forms. The negative forms, then the metal is then heated up to a certain temperature and poured into these hollows, into these voids or negative forms. And then from that, you get cast iron that's got the texture of the sand, very elemental, elemental process of casting, but yet it spoke so much to me about time and weathering, and this idea then again of taking something flat, shifting it and translating it into three dimensions, and because so this is the series of the cast iron that came from that process. Something to show you of scale in relationship to the megalith photographs. And for me, the process, of course, is critical to the work, But even though I do have a drawing practice, the drawing itself does extend into different relationships. So for me, even though this is cast iron sculpture, for me, this is very much coming out of a drawing practice. And I think of these, every few years I think of them as studies or experiments that drawing as it moves from a flat surface into 3 dimensions, what are the shifts that happen? And this is very much still part of a drawing practice, and the relationships that also happen between the works. This is another cast iron work that is again taking woodcuts and using a repetition of a module or a grid to create a sculptural sort of landscape work called object repetition. So the module itself is repeated, and then it's also doubled and it's extended. So that is what ultimately creates this wall as well. And I've been throughout, I think, quite interested in this idea of repetition as maybe a state of anxiety, as something that repeats and what happens as it shifts. I tend to also work with seriality. So one work, is made up of several, and what are the things that happen within the works that continue to shift or continue to then also repeat themselves. So going back to another work, back to the print studio, which is very much, I think in the last 6 years, has actually affected not just my drawing practice, but in many ways about how I actually think about line itself that's drawn on paper. One of the things that I was really struck by the etching process is that it is not just drawing on copper, but is essentially a 3-dimensional line that you're drawing onto a plate, and then you are putting it through a process that is eating away at that line that you've drawn. It's inked, and then it's put through a printing press. And as I was working through the I'm jumping a little bit back and forth, but I had come back to Delhi and I had set up a small sort of etching room in the house. And, I was really struck by the way in Glasgow that the line actually, as it's sort of etched, creates depth. It creates depth as you dip it into the ferric or the nitric, depending on what you use. And it creates this kind of 3-dimensional groove in which the ink sits in. And once the work is printed or the plate is printed, you can actually feel the tactility of that line. This for me, even though I think to most printmakers is part of the beauty of etching and is quite common, for me this is quite a revelation that line can actually be 3-dimensional on the paper, and what are the things that can happen with that. So I just wanted to also share some of the really things that nobody really sees, because the work is always presented as this sort of final stage. But for me, the process of getting to that final stage was actually quite challenging, because etching is not an easy thing to set up in your own home. But also the different kinds of line weights that I was getting on the copper, different times, different tools, and the different kinds of, the copper that you get in the UK is different to the copper that you get in Delhi. The kinds of ferric that I make here, because of the weather, I was doing this in the middle of the monsoon, it has a reaction. So everything became this sort of trace of this time, of this chemical, and the plate seemed to retain those traces, because either had not polished the plate, and even though the drawings that I do are quite sort of prim and a bit precise and clean in a way, there was something that I really was quite drawn to with these marks that were sometimes not of my own choosing. I could control certain lines that I was drawing, but ultimately not everything. some of the early, like really early studies. This is done on handmade khadi paper. And one of the plates that I really, something had spoken to me about the plate itself. It was an old piece of copper from Old Delhi, and it had you can see I can't show you with any pointer, but there are lines on this copper piece that have been retained from the way the copper was moved, maybe by the structure in which the copper sheets were held, and at this time I was like, this is not like a smooth piece of copper. It's got sort of marks, almost like pock marks and holes, and I decided to do the most absurd thing for my work, is that I left the marks and I worked with a dry point needle, which is ultimately, there's no acid involved, there's no ferric involved, sorry. And it's the most delicate of lines because you're just incising lines into the copper plate. And that's where the ink is retained. And there was this relationship for me about this material of this copper that had retained all the imperfections and the scars and the sort of traces of where it had traveled and had been kept. And then this drawing, and then as it sort of approaches my studio table, what are the marks that I'm making? And there was something about this form that I had worked on that I will also just share with you in the next few images. This is then going back to Glasgow with the plates that I had worked on in Delhi. And, I find myself in the last few years working in a space that seems to be in between places. Literally, at first, it was in between cities because of the move from New York to Delhi. There's certain, issues of, what are the spaces that you inhabit? What are the in-between spaces as well? And in this kind of ambiguity, I think there's something that I've been trying to think of in terms of also a language in drawing, that the earlier perspective drawings that I had shown seem to be quite sure that these are autobiographical spaces, or this is the unity building that's been stripped of its height and its mass. And in the past few years, I've been more interested in thinking about drawing as maybe an incomplete language, and it's something that is not fully able to translate, something where perhaps in its sort of ambiguity, in that kind of space where it meanders a little bit here and there, what are the things that happen? And I've definitely obviously been interested in architectural drawing, but also through an earlier residency in Northern California, I was also interested in the way that music notations also have a certain kind of language of their own. And through the past sort of 6-7 years, I've been working on a language through these flatland drawings that are in between music scores, in between architectural lines, but sort of fall, in not able to communicate either, but sort of are fairly incomplete. And these ruined scores for me also, each plate has about 3 to 6, depending on the plate, layers of etched line. So I just wanted to show a detail of the print on the right side, because this print also has a lot of depth and tactility, and I think the different etching times also create a certain kind of three-dimensionality on the surface itself. So the ruined scores are a series of etchings on paper that were published by the Print Studio, and also very much, this is something that the etching process is very much something that I've been studying and trying to learn through Stuart Duffin, through the master printer at the studio. And these are some of the sort of details of the ruined scores. You can see the sort of also the way the hand has moved has left those sort of fragmented little bits and little curves. And there was something quite, I was quite enjoying the way that the hand was also moving on the wax ground itself, because it does retain these kinds of ways that your hand moves. These are the unit objects that I initially worked on in 2014, but were very much the first time I had worked with a master printer. And this was, I'd been working earlier on a series of drawings called the unit objects. And this is just graphite pencil on paper with gouache. And I've been quite interested in the ways that perspective can also shift. So if you take certain kinds of axonometric drawings, isometric drawings, start projecting different kinds of viewpoints. And one of the books that was really quite influential for me was the Scolari's History of Anti-Perspective. So Renaissance perspective gives you a point of view in terms of scale where you, the viewer, are looking back at space or into space in a particular way. But the other methods of perspective drawing that ultimately collapse that. So the hierarchy of the viewer, is shifted. You see that in Chinese scrolls or Japanese woodcuts or miniature paintings, where ultimately within the flatness, you can have different forms of space existing on one plane that shifts the view, that shifts the scale as well. And I was quite taken with a plan of a garden, a drawing of a garden that showed a plan, a section, an elevation, and the space between each in a particular way. And I think next time I might actually include that in the presentation as well. So I'd started a number of these drawings using, again, the basic elements of architecture, the column, the grid, a beam, the wall, and sort of creating these kinds of sort of windows or object-like views into a particular space. And these unit objects are essentially, using, again, the unit of a particular module and repeating them. So in Glasgow, I was quite interested in working with this drawing series, and the etching, which developed into a series of 7 etchings and Aqua Tint, started. This is the first time when I really was looking at the line as a 3-dimensional form. The ink that's also deposited on the paper. What does that materiality provoke? What can be evoked also by these sort of ultimately landscape views. And one of the works, so this is the idea of a house, something that has an enclosure. For me, this one was quite an unusual work because I was alluding to the idea of a sculpture garden in the landscape using, the barest of means. So the idea also of a curve within the grid and what that can provoke something maybe of a gentle disruption, or if the curve is really extreme, can actually really start to have a certain kind of disruption level that was quite interesting also to think about. And it got me thinking about landscape also, this idea of a window, the thresholds between inside and public and private. And ultimately these kinds of forms that sort of come into the interior space. So there are different forms that I was essentially playing with and sort of stretching out, cutting, But ultimately, these for me are very much about landscape. These are essentially landscape drawings or landscape etchings. And also for me, I think the way that drawing and its relationship to landscape is something that is quite important. How do you locate the self in this landscape, and what are the things that you extract from it and sort of translate back? And somewhere in that translation, drawing has its own language, whether it's controlled through perspective or whether it's intuitive through another set of ideas and means. And within that sort of control and intuition, I think, and materiality is where I start to really, I think that's when drawing can also take you into things that are unexpected as well. The last work that I wanted to share with you actually is very much a landscape work that combines not just drawing, but landscape photography as well, and printmaking. And these are different sets of collaborations as well at different stages of the process. So a few years back, I had taken a trip from Amritsar to Lahore on the Grand Trunk Road. And those of you who are familiar with the politics of the region know that this has historically been a trading route, but has also been fraught with a certain violence and separation through historical partitions. And this separation and partition very much is part of our current political landscape. They're very much things that we deal with on a day-to-day basis in terms of how things are segregated, how things are viewed. What I was struck by on this day was, as I was driving to Atari, was the landscape around me. It was a really beautiful day. The countryside in this area was just really beautiful. The AQI was low. And I was struck by how much of what I was seeing that day was really not what I was seeing at all. The text and the language of literature, especially, and poetry through the writers and the poets, that for some of us who are really been reading about partition, how much of that filters through? What about the narratives and the storytelling that has occurred within families as well? How much of that becomes a part of how you view the landscape? And I was really struck by that what I was seeing was not really what I was seeing, and the traces of all these other things that were of an interior nature for me. So language, certain kinds of texts that you had held on to were being projected onto this landscape. So it wasn't this landscape at all, but something that was being interpreted at multiple levels. This is just an image that I have really loved since that trip. And it is the small sort of trolley that takes you from Atari to Wagah. And as most of you know, who are from the region, the last few years have been extremely tumultuous and of a particular nature, which we don't need to get into now. But I was struck by the different kinds of people that were making this journey, and what this line of separation, ultimately a cartographic separation, has done and reverberated over the past few decades within different lives and diverse lives as well. So this is a trolley where everyone's taking their suitcase from one side of the border of the Indian side to the Pakistani side, and it's one that's been well documented as well. But this is no man's land that exists. And Lahore, I was struck by this idea, or this moment in the old city of the collapse of different kinds of time. So the image that you see on the left is the Badshahi Mosque in the World City, built in 1671, and the Samadhi of Ranjit Singh, built in 1848, and three young men on a casual sort of walk in the old city. And I was really struck by the sort of collapse of the different times and the kind of ways that this space existed. And and the image on the right is of an exterior wall of one of the forts in the walled city as well. The sort of left traces of time, the shadows also of the things that have been constructed around it, and remains as a line, as a barrier between things as well. Moving forward, a few months later, I was on a trip and I was struck by the Gandhara works in the Government Museum in Chandigarh. And I wanted to go back and work with Randhir Singh. Maybe as some of you might be familiar, he's an architectural photographer. And I had been very keen to work with these sculptures because at that point I didn't know, but they spoke to me about something about time, and also not being able to fully speak for themselves, because this is also the Gandhara narrative has also been one that has been they've been given different sets of sort of ideologies from sort of east-west binaries because of the Greek influence becomes higher, when in fact Gandhara is an accumulation of many cultures, from Greek to Syrian, Syrian to Persian, Persian to the subcontinent, and a subcontinent, what is now the subcontinent. But this accumulation then this sort of was left behind. This is also a collection that was divided at the partition. So Randhir and I worked together on the photographs, and he's an architectural photographer. And we had been sort of working together to, you know, this isn't to document the sculptures or the objects themselves, but I think we were both drawn to the sort of edges of things, the sort of perimeter walls, something that was neither fully the object or neither fully the architecture. And obviously this is the Corbusier design, sort of modernist museum in Chandigarh, but that is really not, it is part of obviously what the building is, but for me that is not the most critical thing. The most critical thing felt about this engagement with what these sort of edges of these objects were doing. And just show again some of the process, some of the marks that I was making at the time, as I was tracing some of these photographs with this heavy oil, and some were fairly delicate also in nature. As I went back to Glasgow, the process of the photogravure and working with one of the master printers there, Alistair Gow, became really critical. And with him, it's not just the expertise, but it's also collaborating with the printmaker is also a very unique thing, not just in terms of the knowledge, but also the sensitivity about how a printmaker works with another artist. So there are many aspects of this process that were, from the ink, also to the paper, to the consistency of the ink, which actually is the way that your eye will view the ultimate print itself. So Argument from Silence is a work of 10 prints on paper. And I wanted to just read a little bit about the phrase argument from silence. The phrase argument from silence is described as an attempt to prove a negative. In the context of history, it refers to an argument made in the absence of evidence. This relationship of erasure, language, and history stayed with me, and I felt had found a place in the work itself. Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Seher. That was absolutely wonderful, and lovely to watch all those beautiful works. Although sadly on a very small screen. Um, I'm sure that everybody who attended today must have thoroughly enjoyed the work as well. Just before I let the audience kind of pen down some of their thoughts and questions, I just maybe put forward some of the things that I found very interesting in your work, and maybe start with a couple of questions to warm up the the discussions. One is what I found nice and very interesting is that how at different different um, let's say sets of work that you've done or different portfolios also carry with them very different kinds of textures, like whether it is the texture of the fiber or the texture of the wood, um, or the sand texture on the metal sculpture. I mean, of course, it's very fine to kind of even pay attention to, but then once you kind of maybe get close to it, one would probably get a sense of that, or the texture of the metal sheet on the paper, the copper, the thickness of the line that really comes into it. And also interestingly, usually it is a play of notations in drawings that are interesting. Of course, they of course fade in background, and you're immersed in some sense into the work itself. But in some of your work, there's a nice theatricality between textures, notations, and forms. There's a nice interplay between all these three things at all time in all the works. And the other thing that really interested me, or kind of, or something that I liked, was how there was a shift from abstraction of form. Let's say, like, you're trying to abstract modernist architectural works, or abstract, let's say, maybe their interpretations at various scales, but slowly in, let's say, the series on scores, the music scores, there's an abstraction of notations itself, which is quite nice actually, to kind of move from abstraction to almost hyper abstraction, kind of making it ambiguous. And that somehow the scores thing also reminded me of early 1980s Liebeskind's machine drawings, in their kind of brute nature, and almost like scars on the surface. So it's in an interesting way, bringing back very, very interesting connotations and references in that sense, like talking about events and talking about things that leave mark on surfaces, which is nice to kind of also see coming out of that thing. And the third thing that really also, the shift that I found, which was interesting, is the the shift from two-dimensional to three-dimensional, of the Poche drawings. It was as if they were waiting to come to life from paper to into a sculptural form. And especially when you start to do those step series, or the Corbel series, where they're kind of getting offsetted. It was almost like a mysterious sense of blossoming to those sculptures. Like, they were no longer the stoic, poche black objects that are just sitting by themselves, but now they are transforming and becoming something else. And that coming to life was a very interesting, a sense. I mean, that sense of coming to life was very interesting for me to note in those things. And I have two very basic questions following these things. One is, as a person who studied architecture in that sense, at what point did you think, or you committed yourself fully to the practice of drawing? When was the transition phase?
Sure. Just give me 1 second. I'm going to quickly
Yeah.
turn the light on
Sure,
because
sure,
it's
sure.
getting it. It's a little bit. But there are the two things that you actually touched on that are really, really important to me as well. And I went to school in the early to mid 90s.
Right.
And one of the things that, the kind of things that were contemporary at the time were very much looking at deconstructivist architecture, the ways that, even Zahedid's paintings. And for me, actually, Libeskind, the Micromakers drawing, had a huge impact, because it wasn't just, not just the way that these fragments were presented, but it's this kind of breaking down of the material. I think it's the fragmenting, not just of form, but also of ideas, how things get splintered. And there are few projects that I've been lucky enough to actually see, that I had seen only through drawings and through photographs when I was 18 to 22 or 21, whenever I went to school. And the Miralles and Karma Pino's, the Igualada Library, it's another one that fragments certain things through the material. It's something where these structures, in a way, it is theatrical. But it's presenting you in this kind of all-encompassing space. And I think this idea of fragmentation, where you're fully enveloped, where you are entering something, really, like it was very difficult. After college, after RISD, I did work in an architectural office that worked on skyscrapers mainly, and these kinds of like monolithic large structures that could be placed anywhere. For me, it felt like they could be placed anywhere. There was a real disconnect, and that's the last project that I worked on, obviously in a team, was the Beijing World Trade Center. And for me, that, I was attracted to this idea of the large scale and the landscape. But through that project, I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I knew what I didn't want to do. It was very clear to me that these kinds of projects, like, not only had ethical ramifications, but it was a complete disconnect of the object in the landscape. There were things that were happening within that project that just didn't feel, it wasn't for me. So in sort of like in a response to that, I went, I'd always been drawing. I've always used drawing as, obviously in architecture school, because none of us were using CAD. No one had a computer. We were very late to it. But in that sort of reaction to this sort of architectural, sort of more like office environment of the built environment, I started thinking about, just working on a series of perspective drawings, but large scale perspective drawings again. And I began with what I knew, which were the spaces that I had seen, as I was growing up. Certain kinds of courtyard spaces, whether they were sort of urban public courtyards in Brussels, like urban plazas, or whether there were certain sort of mosque complexes in Pakistan. And I felt like there was something, almost unraveling as I was doing this. It was almost like I'm going to do these autobiographical large scale drawings, but I wanted the viewer to be, again, enveloped. So the scale became really critical. So the 10 to 14 feet, your body is a particular height, the drawing is much larger than you. And then the surface is like, as you come to the drawing, is filled with these fragmented pieces. They're highly detailed, they're quite labor intensive works. It was around this time that, I wanted to be close to architecture. I wanted to think about space, but I wasn't able to do that through an office sort of built environment. But I was very much interested in the ideas that were being generated. And this is when sort of, I made the shift. So, which also was confusing, for some reason in the art world, it's, if you're an architect and you start drawing, it becomes very confusing, which I really don't understand, because all these fields are interconnected, and there's a relationship between everything, between all our fields. And so it was around that time, out of frustration, that I went into it. But then something happened in that frustration as I developed these drawings. But the thing of the hyper abstraction is also something that in the last few years, The earlier perspective drawings, you know the space that you're getting into.
Right.
There's a foreground and background at the simplest levels. There's certain columns, scale is shifting, you're moving back into space. But I'm finding this, actually this writer had put it better than I can in our conversations, is this kind of gray zone where even through anti-perspective, where things are sort of, there's a flatness to certain things.
Right.
So I'm sort of jumping between works, but in the middle of all of this, there was a certain kind of ink on paper drawing that I was doing that was almost like screens that were, there was no depth in that, although it was still trying to push and create perspective. But then it, like in the unit objects that I was showing, those sort of flat graphite drawings, everything gets like three-dimensional again once it goes into etchings.
Right.
So it's that kind of play of not just notations, but also of material depth.
Right.
How are things, what happens when you start using different kinds of weights on the paper?
Right. Nice. And second question is perhaps a little bit more silly, but also something that I keep pondering upon. So please bear with me out for this.
No.
The thing is, the thing that what is interesting also about your presentation, that you were willing to open up the process and the practice of how you actually do it, to whatever extent it was possible. And one of the things that also that keeps coming back to me is that often it's one gets an idea to kind of pursue, let's say, a series of work, or to kind of develop a set of work. But then I was wondering, at what point do you finish that series? And I'm often kind of inclined towards thinking that it is often some sort of a provocation, or some sort of a commission, or some sort of an invitation to present the work. I'm always inclined to think that is when you say, okay, one needs to stop, or what are your thoughts on this? Like, when do you begin and when do you stop? Like,
so something that I started in the first image that I showed of the interior courtyard,
right.
that I had started in sort of 2003, 2004, that is still ongoing.
Right.
So I thought every few years I would revisit the idea of what this interior courtyard would be.
Right.
Whether, how does it shift? I'm not an artist that does commissions,
Right.
but, there is a point, and I do tend to work on things like in series.
Right.
So the unit objects, even the ruin scores, they begin as something and then they shift.
Right.
But for me, it's still part of the same series. And I do understand that the structure, when the work leaves your studio,
right.
So I'm going to have a solo exhibition that presents 5 works together in the middle or end of March. Sorry, in middle of March. But I haven't had, the idea of an exhibition for me is when I have something to say. When there's a moment where there's this work has sort of been accumulated and grouped, and there's that relationship between the works. That for me is the point where I feel like I have to say something.
Right.
So, and everything else is ongoing.
Right.
So, so it varies. I tend to work in long series of works, but like for me, the woodcuts and the cast iron they're like related.
Right.
So now I might go back to the woodcuts, so that process remains
Right.
for a while. But they're drawings that I've been working on for many years that sometimes no one sees them because I don't want to share them. And but for me, in the structure of exhibitions and having to construct an exhibition,
Right.
that is also a different kind of language.
Right.
So for me, it becomes more about, I'm interested in what are the relationships that I see in some works. And that is for me, that becomes an interesting or nice time to share the work then.
Right. So you wait for a certain amount of work to kind of be there,
well,
out there.
till I feel I've got something to say.
Right.
Some artists, I think, have something to say all the time.
Right.
I find myself, I don't have things to say all the time.
Right.
But and that doesn't mean that I show everything. There are only 5 works from the past 5-6 years
Right.
that will be presented.
Right.
So it's quite specific. It's quite, the space is quite
Right.
controlled.
Right.
Yeah.
It's just a related last question, and then I'll
Sure.
open to the
No, no.
audience. That when you say that, that that a lot of artists have something to say all the time, right? And then you find it struggling, maybe sometimes, to struggle to find words, or find meaning in the work, in the broadest sense. So do you think it is in a sense always important to know what you're going to say, or in the sense, like, or is it always important to say something, or can the work speak for itself, like?
I think that actually, Shriyank, I think that you've actually touched on the thing where I find myself in the past 2-3 years.
Right.
I think that there is something about I'll put it in slightly vague terms,
Mm-hmm.
but how the external landscape, let's say the external social,
Right.
cultural, political, however you may want to see it, landscape, I've really, I am interested in how do you say things without saying them?
Mm.
Do things become a substitute? Do things, I don't mean like, are they metaphors or are they like, but what are these ideas that are translating? These things take time to even filter through for yourself.
Right.
Um, so I think that I am definitely more drawn to works that are less confident about the. I'm not using the correct language here,
Right.
but
Right. Right.
um, I think that over time, I'm definitely attracted to or drawn to work that is inhabiting that ambiguous space.
Right.
It's trying to also still figure itself out.
Mm. Mm.
And as I'm looking at a work, as I'm digesting a work, maybe there's some traces of that remain.
Right. Right.
Everything doesn't have to be so sure of itself all the time.
True.
And I think there are ways to navigate it, but the space, you have your studio space and the
Mm.
kind of things that happen within that, to how someone else views a work
Right.
in a gallery or museum or something, it's a completely different environment.
Right.
So that's why I think that I'm quite interested in sharing how a work is made. I
Right.
shared a few images of the final works,
Yeah.
but the act of making the work is the work.
True.
So I think for me, the process at this stage, maybe in my life, like the process is really like exciting and intriguing, and they're intuitive decisions also that I have now become more confident in
Right.
trusting.
Right. Right.
Yeah,
Nice.
that's
Nice. I'll go to the audience questions. I have many more popping in my head, but I'll leave it for some of the time. So Nino de Rice, if I'm pronouncing it correct, is asking, could you tell a bit more about the direct or not direct relation of your work to the outside built world, or maybe the city, or how it tells us things about the objects we move in between the buildings?
yeah. So the relationship of work to the outside built world. So this is something. Actually, it's quite a difficult question because it operates at different scales. There are works that I have physically gone out into the landscape because I was drawn to something. Um, the sort of trace drawings that take these kinds of concrete sites from different cities, or when I went with Rindhir to the government museum in Chandigarh, because I was drawn to, there was something that was speaking to me, there's something that I wanted to engage with. At that point, you're not sure. You don't know where the work is really going to go, but you're drawn to, there's something that you want to engage with it.
Right.
But I think that it depends. For me, it also there is something about the correlation between the external landscape and the kind of interiority that drawing also drawing presents. And that's not just for me. I think that there are many there are friends who also have been invested in like a drawing practice for many years.
Mm.
Drawing, is, and it's a particular kind of drawing practice that is done alone for many hours. So it creates a certain kind of environment to work in as well.
Right.
And I find that I can explain to you that this is the work, this is this, and this is where I went. And I can explain everything about the external.
Mm.
But I think that if you let work sit over time, and there also, this is a maybe it's not that unique, but this kind of turbulence that's also happening within our external landscape at various scales. How does that actually, sink in to a drawing practice? And it
Right.
also, you're talking about yourself, you're talking about the most personal thing possible. It's a mark that you've made in, and certain practices also, I think, have a certain anxiety. Marks also retain certain kinds of anxieties about what is happening in the landscape. So there are different ways. Some are literal, where I went to the government museum and these are the works. But
Mm.
then what happens with those other marks is, somewhere in between control and intuition, maybe.
Mm.
And I think that's where maybe I find myself
Right.
having a direct relationship with the external or the outside
Right.
in different scales, at different scales.
I'll just add to the to Mino's question, the second question that he has regarding to the materials and how they shift in time. For example, by weathering, how is this different from the cast iron objects versus the buildings you have designed as an architect? How is this differently surprising?
Um, the sense of time is completely different. I think this is something actually that I Randir and I have actually had some discussions on this, where photographs of new buildings are always presented in their shiny new way. Like in a shiny new, everything's empty, here's the building. Um, and I remember that as someone working in the office, that buildings are presented in a particular way with a particular kind of newness around them. But the weathering itself, like what happens to architecture, to a building after time, that's also very much part of the materiality of the architecture.
Right.
And I think in many cities, we can see where it's like completely failed and where material considerations have not been taken into account, where maybe material considerations are there just for the first 2, 3 years, but after 5 years,
Right.
it disintegrates and falls apart. And weather and weathering is ultimately the reasons for that as well.
True.
But also how material changes through time is quite interesting. It's something that left outside, or if it's protected, do you have a patina, a safe like patina? What do you leave it? How do the colors change? Also, the megaliths, the photographs of those megaliths as well, as these kind of line structures in the landscape. What are the things that they've accumulated on their surface itself over time? And I think it's just interesting also to see that, um, because you have a literal surface trace of time on these buildings or objects.
I think it was forgetting the why am I forgetting the name? I don't know. It is John Ruskin. Sorry, who famously coined the term "stain of time." Like
Mhm.
in some sense, it just reminds me of that. There's a question from Muhammad Hussein. How do you fill the gap between architecture and printmaking? What process helps you to play between these?
Um, so I'm trying to think of, for me, It's also the how do you define architecture?
Right.
I think that I have I definitely engage with architecture because I look at things in the outside landscape. I've drawn them, I've shifted them, I've translated them, I've worked with them. But I think that maybe what is a better way to describe it is not so much architectural but spatial. It has to do with space and the construction of space that does include architecture.
Right.
So the idea of a space also, when you look at the exterior versus the interior, these are also spaces. These are also particular constructed spaces.
Right.
So I think that architecture is very much, I'm very much involved with looking at particular moments and particular sites. But I think that what I'm trying to do is also translate certain kind of spatial studies through material or through drawing.
Yeah.
Um, so I think that, and printmaking for me in the last 6 years, I'm finding that that's really opened up certain avenues that drawing just on paper has not. So you know how the line that's carved into the copper,
Right.
what that does when the ink is there. That's still there's space in that ink. There's there's
Yeah.
what are the kinds of like responses that you can see when you actually see the print. Um, so I think that ultimately, I'm always drawn back to college, my college, in that foundation of drawing, history, 2 dimension, 3 dimensions were always presented as equals.
Right.
And the part that becomes segregated is that when you go off onto your own disciplines.
Mm.
But graphic design, drawing, apparel, architecture, film, printmaking are all related. And ultimately, that Renaissance education was that you had to be at least proficient in the 3, 4 disciplines because you were engaged with every one of these aspects. It's just not, it's, as an artist, I don't know, it's very, I think that it's generally quite segregated.
Right.
Um, and I'm finding that even looking at reading literature, that can also conjure like images of such incredible like spatial constructions.
True.
And I'm doing it through language, a
Right.
different kind of language. So that I like the sort of plays between the sort of boundaries and
Right.
peripheries of fields. Maybe.
Mm. That's quite interesting, actually. I'll invite maybe Prasad, Dipti, if it's possible to maybe call him. He has a long question and he prefers to ask it in person. Yeah, Prasad.
Hi, hi. Thanks. Can you hear me, Share?
Yes.
Yes,
Right.
yes.
Yeah, yeah. Sir, first of all, thanks. Thank you very much. I mean, this is so lovely. This is so nice, actually. Uh, you know, and I think we also spoke of this earlier, but that time you were not into foundries, and or maybe I didn't see the foundries and the cast irons and copper that time, actually. But the the discomfort of cartographic orthography is a key in shaping your practice, isn't it? I mean, that has been the kind of a key stimulator, really. And you engage with it by reworking the logics. You do many things. You alter the logics of perspective, alter the logics of axonometry, alter the logics of isometry, mix things, and you strip them of being representational, being representational of another space, but by themselves they're fully, by themselves they are entities. And you also work with overlaps and many other things, and with the foundry, with the cast iron, with the copper, I saw you're bringing in material, processes, and spaces, almost directly into the drawing. I was thinking, do you see yourself moving completely out of orthography? Because 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 in the sense that the parallel lines and the precision of orthography are still there in your in your drawing, actually. but the foundry allows for uh, you know uh, 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 you know material of different temperatures, seepages, uh, uh, going beyond the mold, and many things that are smudgy, that are kind of, and the material also, the material logics you yourself described, the change of colors. So will do you think the drawing practice will kind of move slowly beyond, completely out of orthography, completely out of orthography, and kind of enter into logics of the materials and spaces and processes, do you think that shift happening in the practice?
I think so. So there are two questions here. One is, I think you've also touched on this idea of discomfort of,
Yeah.
let's say, geography. And this is something that's been with me, I think, in terms of just, that was also one of the reasons also for wanting to do, I think, these sort of large scale perspective drawings that were rooted in these autobiographical spaces as a way to kind of unravel certain things, to maybe also leave them behind, and to, just, ownership is not the right word, but to sort of maybe understand it, but understand it through a language that I was really very much engaged with, which is architectural, representational architectural methods. Um, and I think that this sense of, let's say, anxiety and geography, you know, it's just always been there. Maybe because of my own biography, in that I was, born in Pakistan. I moved through different cities, and the longest I've been in a place is New York, and now the last 6-7 years I'm living here, which obviously, because of my biography, presents, it's a good way to put this, certain challenges. But it's something that, but I've also, sort of unraveled that for myself and presented it back. But also, I've extended that into architectural history, things that were presented to me as fact. And I never, I think the drawing also, became interested in how things can fragment, how you can present things in different ways. And it shifts the hierarchy completely. Um, so you can unravel perspective, you can look at objects in the landscape in different ways, and they present new ways of looking at them through scale or through material, or through even just like through a way a viewer looks at the drawing itself. So I'd worked with particular sort of archives as well in London, looking at sort of colonial photographs. I've drawn sort of perspectives from photographs, sort of unraveling their hierarchy, their kind of like structural hierarchy, and just sort of this interest in dismantling things that are not quite certain to me, that are they really presented to me in the way that they should be presented to me. And I always have found, since the past like 10-12 years, the figure of Corbusier to be one that was immensely problematic, and yet I am also drawn to certain things. And in the history books, he was always presented as this, obviously the most important architect, Western architect, his iconic buildings, and yet his buildings have also profoundly affected architecture in its ultimate failed states. The Unity building, the certain kind of like radius city, the planning that he's done is also absurd and maniacal. And yet you come here and you see Chandigarh, and we are drawn to these things. Everyone from the West, the first thing, it's like run to Chandigarh, because God knows nothing else exists here. And it's this kind of hierarchy of the Western architect within certain geographies that obviously has a certain hierarchy, and of it that is changing. But in my simple sort of way, it was the figure of Corbusier and how to kind of dismantle things, not in any other sort of, way, but looking at it through architectural representation. I'll take out the height, I'll take out the mass, I'll present it as this kind of, it's part of the landscape without its kind of, volumetric like presence. And I wanted to see what would happen. So there is definitely not so much discomfort, but I think this sort of, it could also be in the personality as well, but like anxiety that like runs through this. There's an anxiety that has like sort of run through relationships of the interior to the exterior. Certain things that need to remain hidden versus what do you present, which is why exhibitions, as Shriyank had said, they're those moments when you have to bring to light certain things. And I try to keep control over that. But then what's interesting is how viewers then interpret that as well. And for me, the second part of the question in terms of the process of the iron itself, and will I move away from a certain kind of practice of, let's say, a drawing or two-dimensional, a drawing on paper, let's say. I don't think so. It's hard to project. I'm very much, the cast iron process is one that I need a foundry. So I need an external thing. The drawing is something that I have control over in my space here. So it's one where it's extreme interiority of drawing to something where I'm working with 5 to 10 to 12 people on the site in the foundry, like, for months on end. So there's a shift. There's like an extreme shift in process as well. But I fully expect to work with cast iron again, but the process is different. And I'd like very much to, like drawing, I think will just be there as the kind of foundation. And then these sort of moments and these kinds of languages can happen. But between etching and cast iron and drawing, I think I've very much invested in the next few years and still learning more about these processes.
Thanks.
If that answers.
Thanks. Yeah.
Thanks, Prasad. There are two more questions ahead. I think if you have some more time.
Sure.
So one is, next question is from anonymous attendee. What are the long durée questions that you hinge on to while you are in the state of ambiguity or anxieties? That's a tough one.
Well, those are completely private. I mean, that's not an informative answer, but anxiety is can be seen when you look at the work, perhaps, if you interpret it that way. But I think those ambiguities and anxieties, again, it's what I said. I think you can't constantly be responding to the external. That's not how work, at least that's not how I work. But it's also, there are things that seep in, there are things that sort of find a place in you. And that sense of discomfort, or as Prasad said, or anxiety, I think drawing and writing, I think, has a correlation that there's a way that gets translated, because drawing itself is its own language. So those ambiguities and anxieties are very much present in the studio space. But I try and keep certain kinds of control over it through the process, through these representational methods. But the ambiguity or the anxieties shift between different things. It's not just for me, it's for many, many of us. How do we interpret what is happening and what is the response? Because you can't be provoked by the external all the time. You have to sit with it and let it simmer and let it fester, or however you choose. And then since I've been, the years that I've been doing this, I'm also learning to trust intuitive decisions. Leaving architecture school, I feel like intuitive decisions were not placed as a primary thing. You always had to have a reason and a rationale for certain things. But in this space of working, I think if you spend the time and you study what you are doing and you allow yourself the time to think through these things, I think I'm finding it really useful to trust in the intuitive as well, because it's a different anchor. So maybe those are the ambiguities of intuition and the anxieties of the external, and how do you control that and translate that for yourself.
Yeah, thanks. There's one last question by
Sure.
Natalie Abbey, and she's saying, "Hello, Seher. First of all, thank you for the presentation. I find your work fascinating and beautiful. I was wondering if you have ever worked with colors."
I get this question a bit about the use of color, but in terms of sort of other colors, I actually have a very difficult time with color. Initially, I think I felt that with just pencil on paper and lead weights in this sort of spectrum of gray and silver and black, there was so much to actually learn through that color just felt like an embellishment to me. Um, and also I think I have a lot to learn about how to use color. But I think I'm still fascinated by graphite, by even the black of the gouache. And within the spectrum of silver and gray and black, there's an entire like thing of, color to use. So I'm content in this space for now. So yeah.
And these were the questions that we had from the audience. Just maybe one last question, Sarah, before we part.
Yeah.
Uh, how, there's a very interesting sense of precision in your work. There's a very sharpness to your work. Like, how important is technique in that sense? Or like, there is intuition at one part, and then there's technique. So how do you kind of?
I'm let's say technique, or there's obviously technical drawing at the back of my education, or let's say through this architectural education. So drafting at sense has been really important to me, because it was something that I was really literally like attracted to and drawn to. But technique is one thing, but I think it's also the craft of, how do you craft a drawing? How do you what is the craft involved with making something? And with drawing is something that I've done since I was so young, that it's just something that you're always trying to, um, I don't want to say better yourself, but you're always trying to learn. There's always something that in drawing that will always surprise you, or that you're like, oh, that's not the way I want to do that.
Right.
But I found that the craft and the technical aspect in printmaking
Right.
and in casting is something there is a world for me to learn. Like, you're always going to be learning. And etching, definitely, because it's a controlled technical process, but it has an infinite amount of things that are not in your control. And I found this from speaking to the master printers who have 40 plus years of experience, that there's still things that happen that are beyond their control.
Right.
But that is, that is also part of the intrigue, I think, of this rather unusual printmaking process that hasn't changed for centuries. The chemicals might be safer now, but
Right.
essentially it's the same process, and everybody is still learning from this. So it's yeah.
Thanks, Seher. I think on that note, if there are no further questions, we can probably end this session.
Sure.
So thank you once again, Seher, for like really engaging with all the questions that came your way and sharing your work with us. Hope that you probably get to attend, if you have time, attend some of the series of the CCT.
Yes.
And I would also like to invite everybody who's attending today to join us for the next CCT lecture. You'll have plenty more ways of looking at drawings from the people who are going to present in the future series. So it's an open invitation for all. Thank you once again, And Seher, it was wonderful having you over.
Thank you for having me.